So 11 p.m, the 20th of December. By the following morning, I suppose, the Northern Ireland wakes up to the news of this.
Mm-hmm. And, probably I heard about it on the radio news. 2004, we maybe weren't getting, news on our phones in quite the same way. So probably I switched on the radio and heard it there.
Was it a kind of like, initially, do you recall, was it appeals for what eyewitnesses? They have something in that they know about the white van and the ginger wigs. They've nearly been within a hair's breadth of this.
Yeah, I think probably some of those details took a little while to emerge. All that was said at first was that there'd been a pretty significant robbery. I think it was probably in the lower tens of millions when it was first mentioned. And then as the day went on, it became clear that this was on an altogether different scale. Later, there was a suggestion that that word had already spread around Belfast city centre on the night of the 20th, that people were already talking in bars about a big robbery. However, the news might have spread there. I don't know. But certainly by the 20th, as we got in further into the 20th, it became clear that the scale of this robbery was such that it was somewhat improbable in a place like Belfast that it could have been done by anything other than an organisation or with the knowledge of a particular organisation.
For sure. And it wasn't long before the Provisional IRA were sort of accused of it. They denied. They issued a statement and denied, did they, by the January?
There were denials. Sinn Féin very particularly denied any involvement by the IRA. So just to place this was, the robbery happens in December 2004. We've had the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. There's been the first attempt at power sharing between the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP. That has collapsed. And just before Christmas 2004, there had been talks between the DUP, Ian Paisley's DUP, he was still the leader at that stage, and Sinn Féin and the governments about a new power sharing government that involved Sinn Féin and the DUP. Would have been unheard of before, but there were still difficulties there, and those talks had broken down. So the robbery happened, and one of the reasons the talks broke down was over the DUP insistence that the IRA get rid of its weapons. And they wanted particular kinds of evidence that the IRA had got rid of its weapons. So for this robbery to happen at the time that it did was problematic.
For lots of reasons.
For lots of reasons, yeah. And the question was, how much did the leadership of Sinn Féin, if this was the IRA, how much did the leadership of Sinn Féin know about the robbery? And did they indeed sanction the robbery? And if they had sanctioned it, and if they knew about it, given the planning that would have to go into that, had they been doing that at the same time as the talks with the British governments and with the British-Irish government and the DUP?
From a practical investigative point of view, the van, the cash, needs to get somewhere quick, safe. Any vehicles used have to be torched. And then you have to divvy it up. It's like a load of drugs because you have a lesser chance of losing the whole lot if you don't have it all held together. So I presume there's a kind of at the other end of this, there is a central location where it's all brought, where it's divvied, where it starts to move around the country very quickly, yeah? So it's like kind of having a glass ball and you drop it on the ground and it shatters. Then it's harder for law enforcement to come after it.
Well, I think the fact that they came back for a second run suggests there was maybe 45 minutes, I think, between the first and the second run. So I think you could probably say, where could you drive to and back and unload a couple of trolleys? So that probably narrows down where they went the first time. The van with the money in it disappears. There's an image of it on CCTV.
And so 45 minutes, right? So that's each way.
Yeah. So 45 minutes there and back. So
so you're talking 20 minutes.
You're talking somewhere within easy reach of Belfast city centre on Christmas, Monday before Christmas traffic. So it's it narrows it down.
Central location then?
It would suggest that it was not too far from the centre. Then after that, where the van then goes, whether it was already, whether that first lot of money was then taken away from there, put into other vehicles and taken away from there, is moot. But there is no other sighting of that van after that piece of CCTV. And bar a very small amount of it, none of the money that was traceable, some of the notes were traceable, none of the money that was traceable was ever found. And so, that the distribution of the money was pretty well organized as well, and really, really, really pretty efficient.
And there's plans probably at the end of that by whoever is getting those funds and how quickly to maneuver them out of the country or into some sort of a laundering operation. Do you think the ban went back? Do you think that decision was made in the night, the second?
Well, there was when the investigation proceeded, there was some discussion around this second run, and there was a strong suggestion that, Kevin McMullen at one point said that in his police interviews, because of course they had to be interviewed by the police, that he had seen Chris Ward whispering to one of the robbers at the back of the van just before it was told to him that there would be a second run. Subsequently, it was put to him in court, to Kevin McMullen, that indeed a second run had been mentioned during the night when they were being held at his house, that it had been mentioned before. So it wasn't necessarily a spur of the moment thing, that there had always been a suggestion that they might do this.
If nothing went wrong, I suppose, in the first one or whatever. By February of 2005, the Gardaí are working obviously with the PSNI. Was it the RUC then or PSNI?
It was PSNI, but they were only recently PSNI'd.
PSNI'd, yeah. So the Gardaí are working with them and they start to raid properties in the February in Dublin and Cork. Some money is recovered. But some money is recovered. Is that the money? So going back to what we started with, those Northern Bank notes, right? So how launderable are they? Well,
they were certainly more traceable. And they were then rendered almost useless by the fact that the Northern Bank just recalled the entire run of notes. And
so that means they don't make them currency, basically.
Yeah, they're all recalled. So any banknotes from that particular run, which would be easily identified by the serial numbers and by colour even. I think they changed the colour after that. Those were all recalled. Now, whether there was any time to spend any of those before that happened. So
that cut down how much?
That cut down,
of the bill.
It did. So
how much was that?
They had possibly about 10 million, I think. Okay. But the head of the PSNI, I think, said that they just made it the greatest theft of waste paper in history.
Okay.
But there was a hell of a lot more.
Well, they still had 16 million in their pockets.
There's still an awful lot of money. And you know what? I mean, I say this in the book, and I can't say it often enough. I just don't understand money laundering. I can't really...
No, I can't get my head around it. You're not alone.
No. So the only people I really think who do know it are money launderers and cops.
Yeah.
And the cops love to tell you about how it works.
A lot of the financial journalists understand it nowadays. Believe it or not.
Okay, but that's... But I do know that there was a bureau de change just south of the border in a very, very remote spot. And very close to the home of a well-known provisional IRA member, that at one stage had a turnover of something like £47,000 a day, every day, including Sundays, and a higher turnover than some of the banks in Dundalk, a few miles away, a city with about, 50,000 people. So I think I could safely say that this particular bureau de change had been used for money laundering purposes. It had recently been closed down, and the suggestion was that after the Northern Bank robbery, the provisional IRA were looking for new routes for their money laundering, and the lead that was followed by the Gardaí and certainly by and the PSNI as well, was that this was happening down towards Cork. And that was where the investigation led. It led there by way of Houston Station, where 3 men were apprehended in a car in Houston Station. And one of them had got into the car, 2 men in the car. One guy gets in, he got off a train from Derry, and he got into the car carrying a holdall. And inside the holdall was, you could not make this up, a box of Daz, or a Daz box that contained money. And the suggestion was that this was laundering.
About 57,000 or something.
So that was it. And that then led to further raids in Cork. There was a Cork connection with the guys in the car, and the Gardaí then pursued that and raided properties in County Cork.
Including Ted Cunningham's.
Yeah.
A financier and somebody who has been very quick to use the courts over the years.
He's been very quick to use them, and he's been in them an awful lot. He remains one of the very few people, in fact, I think probably the only person who has been convicted of anything to do with the Northern Bank robbery.
And how was that? He was convicted of money laundering. There was 2 million, was there, found?
Well, the sums of the exact sum of money that was involved. I have 2.3 million in my head here without opening the book. Something around about that. There were lots of stories that flew around as all this was happening. It seemed somewhat preposterous. I mean, you've got the Daz box with the 50 grand or whatever in it, and then you have a story that some of the money at Ted Cunningham's house was found in a wheelie bin, and that was subsequently discounted. It wasn't in there, but he did seem to have it behind a false wall in his house. But anyway, he had quite a lot of money in his house, and he claimed it was for a property deal that he was doing for a quarry, and that it was not at all connected to the Northern Bank. Gardaí said that when he was interviewed, that off the record, he said it was absolutely connected to the Northern Bank.
Okay. Now, he was ultimately convicted of money laundering, acquitted.
He appealed. There was on a technicality about how his house was searched in the first place and who had signed the warrant.
Yeah.
And on that, he was then released, and then there was a retrial. And he
pleaded guilty the second time.
Yeah,
there was no trial.
But he's since then it is probably still in the courts. He claims that the money was never accounted for. The money that was taken from his property that was never officially connected to the Northern Bank robbery. That Gardaí held on to that and now cannot say where it is. And so he is suing for the last, I think I heard, he was suing for restitution.
Now, as part of the fallout of Ted Cunningham's arrest, Phil Flynn resigned from the Bank of Scotland because they, I think, had a company together. They were co-directors on it. Another unusual story was in Belfast, where there was other raids and a country club used by police.
Yeah,
so some of the cash was found in there.
Yeah, so there was
is that still there? The New Forge. New Forge.
So this had been the police social club, sports club, and because we were in a new era and because it was the PSNI, it had become a club that was open to the public. A bit more, but it was still, a lot of people who were involved with the police would have used the New Forge Country Club. And after all of those raids, there was a tip-off that, I think the initial tip-off was that there were drugs in one of the toilets in the club. So when they when the police went to search their own club, they removed a panel and discovered that there were Northern Bank notes hidden in there. There were a lot of journalists already at the gates of the club, so they'd obviously got the tip off as well.
Yeah.
And it seems pretty clear that this had been to embarrass the PSNI and to deflect from what was happening in these other raids.
The focus, of course, of the actual police investigation goes on Chris Ward. He's seen as the inside man. And those kind of elements we've spoken about, the change of plan that night, that he would usually go up and help out at the bar, his relaxed demeanour, I think, during the day, the difference in how his family may have been treated, the Christmas present that he goes out to buy, all of that kind of came together to form a circumstantial case against him. But there was no witnesses. There was no anything like that. It was threads of evidence.
It was a circumstantial case. So the case wasn't just that about the fact that he was on the rota with Kevin. It was the fact that he prepared the rota. That was one of his duties. Chris Ward's duties was to prepare the rota.
So he would have been the only one that knew him and Kevin were working together.
That was the accusation.
That was the accusation.
He was the only person, that he had manipulated it, and that no one else could have known this.
Yeah.
So in January of 2005, he actually gave an interview to the BBC's Northern Ireland Spotlight programme, in which he talked about suspicion already being directed at him. And he was saying, now, his lawyers say that he thought that Kevin McMullen was also giving an interview to that programme. He gave an interview, though, and he said that he was being unfairly the target of suspicion simply because he was a young working class Catholic from Poleclass, and because of his connections with Celtic, and that there were unfair inferences being, more than inferences, that being made. So he made this documentary, and in the course of that, I watched that on TV, and never having thought that he had anything to do with it, I watched it and I thought, oh my God, I think he might have done. Just something about it. And I'd already had an interest in it, but I then started following the case even more closely. And when he was arrested finally in, I think, November 2005, so about 12 months after, almost 12 months after the robbery, and it came to trial in 2008. And so I went to the trial, and I just, had enough interest. I actually thought I might write a screenplay.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to it, and everything I had understood about the case that I'd heard, picked up from journalist friends, the kind of conversations that you might hear, everything I thought about it in advance crumbled when I went into the court, not the least of which was this thing about the preparation of the rota.
Because it was wrong that he was the only one, and that...
Well, there were two things about this. One was the suggestion that the cash centre was this kind of hermetically sealed, very secure place that nobody except the staff could have seen the rota. And it turned out that indeed a great many people had access to it. I said that word, surely you couldn't walk out of the bank with a cold doll over your shoulder with 1.2 million. Surely people couldn't get down into the cash centre. Well, turns out they could. And so it was proven in court that many people might have seen this, the rota, that the rota was in any case a kind of a negotiation between members of staff, that Kevin McMullen himself had asked for a change in his shifts at one point the previous week because of something he needed to do. And also that he himself had walked. He said he didn't know that he and Chris were on the rota until they...
I don't understand though, because clearly the bank were cooperating with the police investigation into this. So that information would have been forthcoming to the PSNI, and yet the prosecution service still took this case.
I truly have no idea. I really don't.
Yeah.
I say in the book that at the moment where there's some footage shown in court, so Chris Ward's the only person on trial. That's the other thing to say.
And was some evidence heard before this? It kind of unravelled with this, which is the key strand of...
The prosecution case is put, and the prosecution do say it is circumstantial, and that there is nothing in itself wrong with the circumstantial case, but it has to be pretty strong evidence.
And your key strand of that rope of evidence has to be that he was the only one that
he was
knew
the
that
one
rota.
that he manipulated the rota.
That's the strongest, surely.
That is the strongest thing. So there is footage in court of Kevin McMullen walking out on the Friday afternoon before the robbery and walking past the rota, which he said he had not seen.
Right.
And there's also footage of him talking to Chris Ward as Chris does what was called the walk around, I think they called it.
Right.
Where there's a rota and then they take it around and say, here's the shifts you're on. And somebody said, well, do you know what, I can't, can I swap that one? So he's doing that. So there's footage of him talking to Kevin as well on that. So once that's shown, the prosecution case pretty much crumbles. To me, it is, I don't know how they didn't see it. Or if they did see it, did they ignore it? Were they hoping it wouldn't come to light? So that bit, I really, really do not understand. And none of
was
the
that
evidence,
part of the defence case then? That is the key part of the defence case. So the prosecution have laid out their case, which includes evidence from Karen McMullen, and that's she has stood up in court and given incredible evidence. So the defence are literally coming back in with, well, they have this sort of...
Yeah, and the defence don't cross-examine Karen McMullen.
Right.
I think she's been through enough.
They're aware, they're very confident that this piece of evidence they have is enough in any sensible democracy to collapse this case.
You know, what one hopes for, and the other thing to say is this was a juryless trial.
Yeah, Diplock.
So, Diplock court. So the reason that when you have a Diplock court, it's because it's a terrorist-related offence. So the only person who's sitting in the dock is Chris Ward. And it is said in the court that they're not going to speculate about whether an organisation was involved in this. So instantly I'm thinking, well, why is there no jury then? If this is not a terrorist-related offence, why is there no jury for this trial? And nobody suggests that he has benefited or profited from this robbery. Nobody asks where the money went. So there's none of that. And so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, what you would want, you always have to think, what would you want for yourself? What would you want if you were on trial? You would want that you would be given a fair trial, and it was quite clear that the evidence that was being presented, it just didn't stack up. And the longer it went on, I just thought I couldn't understand why the trial was happening.
Did you speak to Chris Ward, or did he talk in the aftermath of this?
No, he didn't. He the whole way through the trial, I mean, the only words I remember him saying in court were "thank you" on the final day when he was told he was free to go.
And he was still only a young man, about 25 then, was he?
20, in his early mid-20s by the time it came to trial. Yeah, and but his lawyer spoke for him afterwards, and I sought out his dad after the trial, because his parents were at the trial the whole way through, and his father in particular behaved with extraordinary dignity, and I tried to find him after the trial just to say I was pleased with the verdict, because
exactly.
The evidence that was presented, you could not have convicted anybody on that evidence.
Yeah. So in the meantime, the focus remains on this belief that the Provisional IRA have carried this out, that nobody else has the capabilities. The late Bobby Story is named during privilege in the House of Commons. And yet nobody ever gets near anybody that you say there could have been 24 people.
Oh, more, possibly more. 24 would be conservative. There are a lot of arrests. And the other thing you have to put into this was shortly after the robbery of the Northern Bank, there was also a murder in a bar in Belfast City Centre of Robert McCartney, which was carried out by members of the Provisional IRA. And the Provisional IRA denied this. Again, Sinn Féin also denied that any Provisional IRA members had been involved to begin with, and eventually accepted that members of the IRA had been involved. It was a particularly horrific murder. It was really violent. And in the aftermath of it, there was a forensic cleanup. the people who were involved in the murder went back into the bar, closed the doors, took the names of everybody in there, cleaned down the place, said, this is IRA business, and you saw nothing. And so because of that happening so close to the Northern Bank robbery, and because of the extraordinary courage of Robert McCartney, the murder victim, his sisters and his partner, their extraordinary courage in speaking out, and speaking, going to Washington DC and speaking to politicians about this, there was a lot of pressure on the IRA and on Sinn Féin for an end to IRA involvement in criminality, all activity, and a final dumping of arms.
Did you think that, did you go with the thought process that this bank robbery was this, pension fund, as I said? Was it as honourable as that?
No, I never went with the pension fund idea at all, simply because I'd never heard of anybody who actually got anything.
And who put out that narrative? Was that coming from the propaganda really of the IRA? Because it does sound honourable that they'd go and do this. Nobody got injured, thankfully, in this. People were terrified and will live with that trauma for the rest of their lives. But if you were to say, we did this for the people who fought for Ireland, it is quite honourable.
I don't know whether it came from there. The other suggestion is that it came from somewhere. I mean, the Sinn Féin and the IRA would always, Sinn Féin would always talk about securocrats, and as though the British, and it's not that it's a total invention, but that everything was an invention of this kind of shadowy security services, casting them in a bad light. As Suzanne Breen, journalist, says, more often, actually, it was a case of a blind eye being turned to IRA activities in the early 2000s, late 1990s and early 2000s. Whether that was a kind of a deflection from some element of the government even that might have wanted this not to derail the peace process, because everything was in service to the peace process. You might say with very good reason. It was still in its early years. So I'm not sure where that emanated from, but I never bought it.
So what you're saying in that case is either they were led away with it to save the peace process, so you didn't bring in these key figures in the provisional IRA. The confirmation of the fact that they had done that would have been too damaging politically. Or is there another school of thought that this robbery occurred and it was put out by securocrats, that the IRA did it in order to do that?
Well, in order to bring pressure
Everything in the north.
I know. It's and sometimes I think just the simplest thing's the easiest one. As again, Suzanne Breen, who I talked to when I was making the book, the Northern Bank Job, the book. Started as a podcast I did for Radio 4, BBC Sounds, and the book is a kind of an expansion on that. But when we were doing the podcast, I talked to Suzanne Breen, and she said really simply, I think they did it because they could. And sometimes that's the simplest thing. They saw the opportunity.
They had the skill set.
Get away with it. They had the skill set, and they thought, we'll do it, and we'll see.
Yeah.
And they might have just banked on nobody would actually care that much, or they might be able to ride out. And possibly they may even have, if it hadn't been for the murder of Robert McCartney, what happened, the pressure that came on Sinn Féin and then the IRA might not have been as intense as it was finally. There's no way of saying that because, of course, those things did happen. But I kind of go along with that view of
opportunity.
They did it because they could, and because they had the resources to.
And while it was perfectly planned, they couldn't have done it elsewhere. They had the sort of the logistic structure within Belfast, within the kind of the short space from that bank. They were able to move the money around. Unplanned was the fact they never foresaw the fact that though 10 million of it was going to be made extinct essentially overnight.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and
so that was a bit of a waste.
well, I suppose that was, and I'm still not sure whether any of that could have. There was a suggestion that some of it might have been laundered at race meetings. So
I was told actually at one point by Felix McKenna, who was the former head of the Criminal Assets Bureau, it must have been a Cheltenham meet in the
Cheltenham,
years
that's what it
after it, that they were keeping an eye because they believed that some of the money was going to be laundered there. But I don't think anything ever came of it. They just suspected it.
Yeah.
But I mean, the crowds that are at Cheltenham, and you know, these people know how to do their business, don't they?
As I say, I'm not really that au fait with money laundering. I've tried my level best to come to terms with it. And
I worked out how to launder on the horses recently with my own money.
Oh.
Let's just say I started out the day right? And I stuck with the kind of mostly the guarantees, mostly. And I did a few other little things, and I came out of it at the other end of the day with all my money back and maybe a few extra bob.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I was thinking in my head, this is how I'd do it if I had hundreds of millions rather than.
Okay. I will. I should have come to you.
Yeah,
then
and I am definitely not mathematical, but it's quite easy when you just get your head into it. So I know how to do it there.
Yeah.
When it comes to this cryptocurrency and all this carry on, I'm not much.
Yeah. I mean, there's another side of this as well, which is Bulgaria.
Yes.
So there was a whole bit of this where Phil Flynn, who you had mentioned, and Ted Cunningham had been in Bulgaria. And there was a suggestion that one of the things they were trying to do was buy a bank in Bulgaria. Now, I mean, I'd say I don't know an awful lot about money laundering, but I would have thought if you own a bank, that mightn't be a bad way to do it if you own a bank in a different country. So there was this other side.
The ambition knows no bounds.
It doesn't, and the IRA was a really large organization. Again, people who I spoke to when we were doing the podcast, and who I quote in the book, and Suzanne Breen, I keep mentioning, wonderful journalist, said there were professional services for the IRA. The money laundering was very, very sophisticated, as was money raising. And so, there were networks for the distribution of this money. And, it wasn't all DAS boxes.
Yeah.
And in fact, maybe in some ways the DAS boxes are the outliers. They're the more sophisticated ways of getting rid of the money.
Yeah, indeed.
And then the horses.
And the horses. What you talked about, I suppose just to finish as well, Karen McMullen saying that's the kind of thing. What was the quote that this?
That would be them blowing up
that's what happened.
Setting fire to the car, because that's what they do in this country.
That's what they do in this country, and that's really where you pull that together in a way throughout the book. It's the legacy. It's what the IRA did, and we all stood back and accepted it. How do you feel about all that now? And
one of the things that I did in the book is, I'm bringing it up to more or less the present day, and the continued presence of paramilitary organisations. And where I live in Belfast, that's loyalist paramilitary organisations. The fact that they exist at all, I think, is a real concern. The fact that they are so visible and that people talk about their presence as almost like a fact of life is really worrying. 27 years after the Good Friday Agreement. This was not at all what I thought we were getting in 1998. And I do think blind eyes being turned in the end does not benefit anyone. There was an awful murder in East Belfast a few years ago, and carried out by members of the UVF, and the type of murder it was really quite similar to the murder of Robert McCartney in 2005. And actually geographically not that far from it. And the fact that, a decade and more later, something similar could happen with people associated with a paramilitary organization. All of that, I think, just does not give you great confidence in where we have arrived at. And I'm not for a minute denying how much has changed for the better in the place I live. And but I do look at that and I think, when, as I say in the book, something more than £26.5 million went the night that van drove off from Wellington Street.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, it's a fascinating read. The Northern Bank Job, Glenn Patterson. What's the footnote?
The Heist and How They Got Away with It.
So I've actually pretty much nearly finished reading it because the sun has been out and I've been sitting out reading. But it's a holiday read, I would say. And we're hoping maybe later in the summer we can run an audio extract, a chapter from it, for anybody who is lying on a beach or whatever normal people do in the summer. I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks a million. Thank you.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.